The moment the news broke, the entire War Council fell silent. Across the massive circular chamber, representatives of the Zelkoth Dominion sat frozen, their bioluminescent eyes flickering with disbelief. The warlords of the Targassi clans shifted uneasily in their seats, their armored forms radiating tension. Even the cold, logical Valari consortium, who prided themselves on emotional control, were murmuring among themselves. All eyes turned to High Chancellor Orvas, leader of the Galactic Federation. Orvas, a towering insectoid with sleek, chitinous plating, felt a sense of dread creeping up his spine. He had faced interstellar conflicts, political upheavals, even near-extinction-level threats, but nothing made him more uneasy than the name that now echoed through the chamber. Humanity. The voice of General Varzan of the Zelkoth Dominion shattered the tense silence. You did what? He roared, his mandibles clicking furiously. His armored fist slammed onto the council table, leaving a deep dent in the reinforced alloy. The High Chancellor remained motionless. There was no excuse. Every species present had heard the same report. An unknown faction within the Federation had arrested an entire team of human mechanics, engineers working aboard a joint galactic vessel. The Valari diplomat adjusted his sleek robes, his reptilian face twitching in unease. This has to be a mistake. No one could be foolish enough to imprison human mechanics. Oh, but they did, snarled General Varzan, his 4 crimson eyes burning with fury. And I demand to know who authorized this insanity. The High Chancellor exhaled slowly, his mandibles twitching. It was not a decision sanctioned by this council. A rogue governor within the Federation acted without approval. The humans have already been detained for. Varzan's clawed hand tore through his seat, shredding it like paper. Detained? You mean they're still alive? Orvas hesitated. Yes, but... A collective shudder ran through the room. It wasn't relief. It was terror. The Valari diplomat muttered something in his own language. A curse, most likely. The Targassi warlords exchanged nervous glances. Even the ever-neutral Yorathi delegation shifted in visible discomfort. Because they all knew what this meant. Human mechanics were not just engineers, they were the backbone of the fleet. General Varzan spoke first, his voice a low growl of disbelief. Tell me, Chancellor, how many ships does the Federation operate? The Chancellor hesitated, unsure where this was going. Hundreds if not thousands. Varzan's mandibles twitched in amusement. And how many of those rely on human mechanics to keep them functional? The room froze. The realization hit like a kinetic strike. The Federation's war fleet, its pride, its power, its main deterrent against external threats, was heavily reliant on human engineering. And they had just imprisoned the very people who kept it operational. The Targassi warlord, a hulking fur-covered brute with tusks, let out a low, grating chuckle. I hope you enjoy drifting in space, Chancellor. Orvas felt a cold sweat forming beneath his chitinous plates. The last time a species had offended human engineers. The last species that had mistreated human mechanics was the Vokari sovereignty, a powerful empire that had believed they could function without human assistance after a diplomatic dispute. They had expelled all human engineers from their ships. Within 3 weeks, over half of their fleet had suffered catastrophic failures. Hyperdrives collapsed mid-jump. Reactor cores overloaded and detonated. Entire battalions were left adrift in dead space, begging for assistance. And when they finally swallowed their pride and called for help, the humans had been merciful, but they had made the Vokari pay an unimaginable price for their arrogance. The situation was worse this time. The imprisoned human mechanics weren't just random engineers. They were stationed aboard critical joint military vessels, responsible for maintaining some of the most advanced experimental starships in the fleet. If they refused to work, the entire Federation's war machine would grind to a halt. Varzan's voice was dangerously soft. Tell me, Chancellor, have the humans responded yet? The Chancellor hesitated. We have not received a formal response. The silence that followed was deafening. No response. That was worse than an attack. Because when humans stopped talking, it meant they were already planning something. A race against time. The Valari diplomat stood abruptly. We need to release them. Immediately. The Chancellor nodded. Yes, we should. No. The chamber turned toward General Varzan, whose face was set in grim determination. You don't need to just release them. You need to beg. Orvas scoffed. Surely you exaggerate. We have the strongest fleet in. Varzan's mandibles clicked in frustration. Oh, do you? Because without those human mechanics, your strongest fleet will turn into the galaxy's largest collection of floating scrap metal. The Targassi warlord chuckled again. If the humans don't fix your ships, do you know what will happen? The Chancellor said nothing. So the warlord leaned forward, grinning. You won't even get the chance to declare war. Your ships will simply stop working. Your planetary defenses will fail. Your fuel stations will start leaking radiation. You will crumble not by battle, but by slow, merciless decay. The Chancellor swallowed hard, because he knew it was true. There's still time, the Valari diplomat urged. We must act before the humans decide retaliation is warranted. If they see this as an attack, Varzan snarled, then they'll make sure none of us ever fly again. Final warning. The High Chancellor stood, his mind racing. The humans hadn't responded. That meant they were watching, waiting to see if the Federation understood the severity of their mistake. They waited too long. It wouldn't be a diplomatic incident anymore. It would be a death sentence. We go to the humans. The Chancellor's voice was tight with urgency. We release them immediately. We offer reparations. And we pray. The doors to the chamber burst open. A trembling aide rushed in, his face ashen with terror. Sir, we have a problem. The Chancellor's mandibles twitched. What now? The aide hesitated, then uttered the words that sent a fresh wave of horror through the chamber. The humans are already moving. The chamber erupted into chaos. And somewhere in deep space, humanity's silent retaliation had already begun. The council chamber descended into chaos. Voices overlapped in a cacophony of panic, accusations, and desperation. High Chancellor Orvas barely had time to process the aide's words before General Varzan's deep, rumbling voice cut through the noise like a blade. You mean to tell me that humanity is already retaliating? The aide, a pale, trembling Valari, swallowed hard. Why yes, sir. We have just received reports from multiple fleets. Federation warships are experiencing catastrophic failures. A stunned silence settled over the room. The Targassi warlord leaned forward, his massive tusks gleaming in the dim chamber light. Be specific, boy. What kind of failures? The aide hesitated, glancing at the High Chancellor before answering. Sir, their ships are shutting down mid-flight. A collective shudder rippled through the assembly. Orvas' mandibles clenched. Shutting down? As in? The aide nodded weakly. Engines failing. Hyperdrives locking up mid-jump. Life support systems mysteriously going offline. Communications going dark. Some ships are even reporting sudden atmosphere leaks and power surges that are frying their navigation systems. A chilling realization dawned upon them. The humans hadn't fired a single shot. They hadn't launched an invasion. They hadn't issued any threats. Instead, they had simply stopped fixing things. And without them, the Federation's entire navy was falling apart. The first casualties of the war that never began. General Varzan's fists clenched, his claws digging into the reinforced table. What ships have been affected? The aide glanced at his datapad, his pale complexion worsening. Sir, it's not just the warships. Everything. Everything? Orvas echoed, his voice dangerously low. The aide nodded shakily. Civilian transport vessels, orbital stations, planetary defense grids. Any system that has had human engineers working on it in the past decade is experiencing failures. Varzan's gaze darkened. This isn't sabotage. The Kryn warlord sneered. How is this not sabotage? The humans are crippling our infrastructure. Varzan shook his head. No. If it were sabotage, they would have left behind obvious destruction. Ships exploding, stations going up in flames. He turned his piercing crimson eyes toward the High Chancellor. This is not an attack. This is simply the natural consequence of your mistake. Orvas' chitinous fingers dug into the armrests of his seat. Varzan leaned forward. You took their mechanics, their engineers, their repair crews. And without them, everything is falling apart. The realization settled over the chamber like a death sentence. The reports get worse. The aide's voice broke the silence again, but this time, it was even more unsteady. Sir, we have an urgent distress call. One of our primary battle stations, the Velrath Command Hub, is. He hesitated. The Valari diplomat's scales darkened in alarm. What's happening? The aide's throat bobbed as he forced himself to continue. The station's reactor core is overheating. The emergency coolant systems aren't responding. And he looked up, eyes wide with fear. Sir, they can't shut it down. The chamber erupted into chaos again. The Valari diplomat nearly leapt out of his seat. They can't shut it down? That station is one of our primary defense hubs. If the reactor goes critical, it will create a cascading explosion that will take out everything in orbit. The aide's voice was barely above a whisper. Orvas felt cold dread seep into his bones. That battle station housed millions of personnel. It controlled over 30 warships stationed in the sector. If it detonated, it would cripple the Federation's defensive network. And there was nothing they could do to stop it. Humanity's power was never in their warships, it was in their knowledge. Varzan exhaled sharply. You fools. You absolute fools. The Kryn warlord bared his fangs. Are you siding with the humans now, Varzan? The general turned his gaze toward the reptilian leader, and for the first time the Kryn warlord felt something strange. Fear. Varzan's voice was low, steady, and filled with conviction. I am not siding with the humans. I am simply acknowledging reality. He gestured toward the holographic display of the failing battle station, where red warning lights blinked ominously. You think power comes from fleets? From guns? From armies? His voice darkened. But the humans knew something we refused to accept. He slammed his fist against the table. Power comes from knowledge. And they had it all. Silence fell over the room. They had been blind. For decades, humanity had quietly integrated itself into the Federation's infrastructure. Not through politics. Not through military conquests. But through utility. They fixed things. They built things. They knew how everything worked. And without them, the entire galactic empire was falling apart. The desperate mission to Earth. Orvas took a slow, deep breath. There was only one course of action left. We must go to Earth. The Kryn warlord scoffed. To beg? Orvas turned to face him, his voice ice-cold. If it means saving our fleets, our stations, our civilization? Yes, to beg. The Valari diplomat nodded instantly. Agreed. We cannot afford to let this continue. Even the Targassi warlord grunted. Humbling but necessary. Only the Kryn warlord remained stiff with prideful rage. Varzan stared at him for a long moment before saying, You don't have to come. Stay here. Watch as your empire crumbles into dust. Then, when your warships fail and your colonies fall silent, you can die knowing your pride was intact. The Kryn warlord's claws scraped against the table. But he said nothing. Orvas nodded, addressing the aide. Prepare a diplomatic vessel. We leave for Earth immediately. The aide hesitated. Sir, what if the humans refuse to meet? Varzan exhaled sharply. Then we are already dead. Meanwhile on Earth, deep within the human military headquarters, Admiral Jonas Beckett leaned back in his chair, studying the reports flooding in. The Federation was crumbling. Power grids, warships, critical infrastructure. All of it was failing just as planned. A small smirk tugged at his lips. Across the table, one of his engineers chuckled. They're panicking, aren't they? Beckett simply nodded. They thought they could treat our people like expendable tools. He turned his gaze toward the stars. Now they're learning what happens when the tools put down their wrenches. The diplomatic vessel soared through the darkness of space, heading straight for Earth. Inside, the tension was thick enough to cut with a blade. High Chancellor Orvas sat at the center of the delegation, his mandibles twitching anxiously. To his right, the Valari diplomat clutched his data tablet like a lifeline, constantly refreshing updates on the Federation's worsening crisis. To his left, General Varzan sat motionless, his crimson eyes narrowed as he stared at nothing in particular. And across from them sat the Kryn warlord, his body rigid with barely contained rage. He had resisted coming, but in the end, pride meant nothing if your fleets were dead in space. The ship's pilot activated the communication channel. We are approaching Sol System. Human orbital defense grid is locking onto us. The delegation members stiffened. This was the moment of truth. Contact with Earth. The view screen flickered to life, revealing a human officer in a crisp Terran defense uniform. His expression was unreadable. His piercing blue eyes analyzed the alien delegation with calculated neutrality. State your purpose. His voice was clipped, professional, cold. Orvas cleared his throat before speaking. We are an official diplomatic delegation representing the Galactic Federation. We seek an urgent audience with your leadership. The officer didn't blink. The Federation recently detained human engineers under questionable circumstances. As a result, many of our citizens are hesitant about engaging in diplomacy. The words were deliberately measured. What he really meant was, we don't trust you anymore. Orvas inclined his head. We understand the gravity of our mistake. That is why we come seeking resolution. There was a pause. Then the officer nodded once. You will proceed to Earth's designated landing zone. Any deviation from your flight path will result in immediate termination. The Kryn warlord bristled. You dare to threaten us? We come in peace. The officer didn't even blink. And yet, peace did not stop your people from arresting ours. A sharp silence followed. Then the view screen went dark. Their entry clearance had been granted. But their position had been made clear. Humanity was not here to beg. The Federation was. The landing. Their ship descended toward the sprawling megacity of New Geneva, the political and military hub of humanity's interstellar operations. As they approached the landing pad, they saw them, rows upon rows of Terran defense soldiers standing at attention. This was no simple diplomatic welcome. It was a reminder of power. The delegation stepped off the ship, their boots touching down on human soil for the first time. Waiting for them was Admiral Jonas Beckett. His presence was commanding, undeniable. He was not a politician. He was a warrior. And his eyes were filled with ice. Walk with me. No greetings. No handshakes. Only orders. The delegation followed, their every step feeling heavier than the last. The walk of humiliation. They moved through the sprawling military complex, passing massive screens displaying live reports from across the galaxy. Everywhere they looked, the Federation's collapse was playing out in real time. Federation Warfleet, 68% of ships grounded due to mechanical failures. Velrath Battle Station, abandoned. Reactor core failure imminent. Council worlds, mass panic as planetary defenses continue to fail. The Kryn warlord's claws twitched. You're watching us fall apart in real time? Admiral Beckett finally turned to face them, his expression impassive. Of course. His gaze swept over the delegation, calculating, judging. Then he continued walking. And they had no choice but to follow. The meeting room. They arrived at a circular conference chamber deep within the complex. The walls were lined with holographic displays of past wars, human victories, and shattered enemies. The seats were already arranged, but there was one clear difference. The human delegation sat first. The aliens remained standing. They had to wait for permission to sit. Orvas realized it instantly. This was no negotiation table. This was a courtroom. And they were the ones on trial. Admiral Beckett leaned forward, his hands folded together. You came here to beg. So start begging. The words were a hammer blow. The Kryn warlord nearly exploded in rage, but Varzan placed a firm hand on his shoulder. A silent warning. Admiral Beckett, Orvas began carefully. We acknowledge our grievous error. The imprisonment of your engineers was an unacceptable breach of trust. We wish to make amends. Beckett didn't even blink. How? Orvas hesitated. We are prepared to offer reparations. Beckett leaned forward. Reparations? Do you think we care about money? The air grew colder. We don't need your credits. We don't need your materials. What we need is an answer. His voice hardened. Why should we fix what you broke? The harsh truth. The Kryn warlord finally snapped. Because without you, the Federation will fall. Your engineers are the backbone of our systems. If you don't help us, everything will collapse. Beckett's gaze was sharp as a knife. Oh, so now you admit it? The warlord growled. We have no choice. Beckett stood, his towering presence filling the room. No, you had a choice. He walked toward the massive viewing window, where the stars stretched endlessly beyond. You had a choice when you first welcomed humanity into your ranks. You had a choice when you let us build your fleets, design your defenses, maintain your infrastructure. He turned back to them, his eyes burning with steel. And you had a choice when you threw our people in chains. The room was deathly silent. Beckett's voice dropped lower. You just didn't think we had a choice. The Kryn warlord stared, breathing heavily. The weight of the words settled over the delegation like a funeral shroud. Orvas swallowed. Admiral Beckett, is there any way forward? Beckett studied them for a long moment. Then he smiled. But it wasn't a kind smile. There is. But you won't like it. The cost of redemption. Humanity will fix your fleets. A ripple of relief passed through the delegation. Until Beckett spoke again. But you will sign an unconditional military and technological agreement. All Federation ships will have permanent human engineering oversight. All critical systems will be under our control. And in times of war, we will have complete veto power over military engagements. Orvas' blood ran cold. You're asking us to surrender. Beckett's smile widened. No, we're asking you to survive. Silence gripped the chamber. The words hung in the air, suffocating, inescapable. No. We're asking you to survive. Admiral Beckett leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, expression cold and unreadable. The alien delegation sat frozen, staring at him as if he had just rewritten the fabric of the universe itself. High Chancellor Orvas's mandibles twitched. You are asking us to place humanity in direct control of our fleets, our infrastructure, our entire military chain of command. Beckett shrugged. I'm not asking. I'm offering you a choice. Accept and your civilization continues. Refuse and... He gestured lazily toward the massive holo display on the wall. The crumbling status of the Federation played out in real time. Ships drifting without power. Orbital stations abandoned as life support failed. Entire planets losing contact as communication networks collapsed. And far beyond those images, the predators of the galaxy were watching. The Valari diplomat's scales darkened with unease. If we sign this agreement, it would mean the Federation will no longer be the dominant power. Humanity would be something beyond it. Beckett tilted his head. I believe you misunderstand. His gaze swept over the delegation, cold and sharp. The Federation is already gone. It died the moment you locked our engineers in a cell. All I'm offering you is the chance to be part of what comes next. A galaxy holding its breath. Outside of Earth, the news spread like wildfire. Broadcasts across 100 systems repeated the same terrifying phrase. Humanity is restructuring the Federation. Governments panicked. Military leaders scrambled to find solutions. Civilian populations held their breath, waiting to see if the galactic balance of power would shift overnight. And in the dark corners of space, those who had long resented the Federation saw an opportunity. The ones who wouldn't accept. Not everyone was willing to surrender to humanity. Even as negotiations continued on Earth, a secret meeting was taking place aboard a hidden station in neutral space. Several of the Federation's most warlike species had gathered. Among them was High Warlord Kravos of the Kryn Dominion, his patience boiling into outright fury. We cannot allow this to happen. If we let humanity take control, they will dictate the future of the galaxy. They will determine who rises and who falls. A Valari admiral nodded, his sleek form shifting uneasily. But what choice do we have? Our fleets are failing, our stations are crumbling. Humanity has already proven they can cripple us without a single shot fired. Kravos slammed his fist onto the table. Then we give them no more time. The others stilled. We launch a strike. No. A hush fell over the war room. Finally, the Valari admiral whispered, You're proposing war? Against the species that has already demonstrated it can disable our fleets at will? Kravos bared his fangs. Yes. Because if we don't, there will never be another chance. A fatal mistake. The Kryn warlord had expected to strike first. He had expected to catch humanity off guard. He had expected to cripple Earth before the humans could respond. He had expected wrong. As soon as the Kryn fleet activated their warships, ready to jump to Sol, their engines failed. One by one their power cores shut down. On the bridge of his flagship, Kravos's blood turned to ice. His officers were in a blind panic. Sir, our reactors are failing. Hyperdrives are dead. We can't. The comms crackled to life. A single voice came through. Cold. Controlled. Human. That was a mistake, Warlord. The wrath of Earth. The Kryn fleet never made it to Earth. Within minutes, the humans had disabled every one of their warships remotely. Within hours, their capital world received a single transmission. A message that would be burned into history forever. Your war has already been lost. Stand down or be made an example. There was no battle. No glorious resistance. Just the unyielding force of inevitability. The final decision. On Earth, the alien delegation watched in stunned horror as the live feed from Kryn space played out. Orvas turned to Admiral Beckett, his voice barely above a whisper. You knew they would try this. Beckett nodded. Of course. We planned for it weeks ago. The Valari diplomat exhaled shakily. You could have wiped them out. Beckett gave him a long look. We still could. Silence. Orvas finally slumped in his chair. And if we sign your agreement? Beckett smiled. Then you won't end up like them. The Chancellor closed his eyes. They had never stood a chance. A galactic empire is born. Within a week, the remaining Federation worlds ratified the treaty. The Galactic Federation ceased to exist. In its place, a new power rose. One built on human oversight, human knowledge, and human control. One where every fleet, every station, every planetary defense network was under human supervision. It wasn't conquest. There was ascendancy. Humanity had not seized power. They had become power itself. The age of humanity begins. In the heart of Earth's military command, Admiral Beckett stood before a vast holographic map of the galaxy. Human-controlled sectors glowed brighter and brighter as new worlds joined the fold. A subordinate stepped forward. "Sir, the last major governments have signed. The transition is complete." Beckett nodded. He had expected resistance. But in the end, reality had spoken louder than pride. The alien races of the galaxy had thought they were the masters. They had thought humanity was just another species to control. They had learned the truth too late. Humanity was never meant to be ruled. They were meant to rule. And now, the galaxy belonged to them.